Hi, very glad to see you on the channel. Before you start listening to the story, write in the comments whether you like the voice on the video. I always thought marriage was about partnership, about having someone in your corner, someone who had your back no matter what. Emily made me believe that once. In the beginning, she was my best friend. We laughed at the same dumb movies, stayed up late talking about our future, made plans for a life built together. But somewhere along the way, something shifted. It wasn't obvious at first. A comment here, a look there. Small things that didn't seem like much on their own, but when stacked together over years, they became something else entirely. "You seriously can't fold laundry properly?" she had scoffed one night, holding up a wrinkled shirt like it was contaminated. "It's not rocket science, Jake." I had laughed it off at the time. I was used to taking orders, following structure. After all, I'd spent years in the Marines. But coming home should have been different. Home was supposed to be a place of respect, of mutual effort. But with Emily, it was as if nothing I did was ever enough. The game night started out as a way to escape that tension, at least for a few hours. Every Friday, we'd go to Mike and Sarah's place, grab some beers, and play cards with a few other friends. It was routine, something to look forward to. But lately, even there, Emily had found a way to make me feel small. "Come on, Jake, just fold already," she teased one night while I hesitated on a bet. "It's not like you're a real poker player." Laughter from around the table. I forced a tight-lipped grin, trying to ignore the heat crawling up my neck. Another night, she had rolled her eyes as I debated between two hands. "Geez, Jake, you overthink everything," she said loudly. "It's probably why you never finish anything you start." Mike chuckled. Sarah gave me a quick, sympathetic glance before looking away. I should have said something then. Should have pushed back. But what was I supposed to do? Cause a scene? Argue with my wife in front of our friends? No, I did what I always did. I swallowed it down, told myself it didn't matter. But it did. It mattered when I started noticing that Emily and Mike always disappeared around the same time during game night. It mattered when I overheard whispers between them, when I caught the way her hand would brush his arm just a little too often. It mattered when I realized she always volunteered to help Sarah with the snacks, but Sarah was never in the kitchen when she did. Something was wrong. I felt it in my gut. And after everything I had endured, after all the jabs, the dismissals, the quiet humiliations, I wasn't about to ignore this. Not anymore. The next game night felt different. Maybe it was because I couldn't unsee the patterns I had ignored for months, or maybe it was because I had finally started paying attention. Emily and Mike had their usual routine. They flirted just enough to be brushed off as harmless, exchanged glances when they thought no one was watching. But I was watching now. I had spent years learning how to read people, small tells, shifts in body language, hesitation in their voices. It had been a skill that kept me alive in the Marines. Now, I was using it to confirm the one thing I didn't want to be true. Emily leaned over Mike's shoulder, laughing at something on his phone. Her hand lingered on his back just a little too long. My jaw tightened, but I forced myself to stay still, to play the part of the oblivious husband. Sarah walked in from the kitchen, carrying a tray of snacks, her expression unreadable. She wasn't stupid. She had to notice something, but she was either choosing not to see it or was too afraid of the truth. I understood that feeling well. We started playing, the usual banter filling the room. I kept my face neutral, pretending to focus on my cards, but my attention was elsewhere. Mike stretched, feigning a yawn. "Gonna grab another drink. Need anything, Em?" She smirked. "Maybe a refill." He winked, then disappeared down the hall. Emily stood, stretching her arms dramatically. I should probably help Sarah in the kitchen. Sarah looked up from her cards, confused. "I don't," but Emily was already walking away, following Mike. The room buzzed with conversation, but all I heard was the pounding in my ears. I placed my cards down, ignoring Jason's question about my hand, and stood up. I moved quietly through the hall, years of muscle memory making my footsteps near silent. I stopped at the bottom of the staircase. They weren't in the kitchen. They were upstairs. I clenched my jaw so hard my teeth ached. I had suspected, but hearing the faint sound of movement above me, of hushed voices, it was real. I took a deep breath, forcing my rage down. Storming up there wouldn't do anything but give them an excuse to lie, to twist the situation, to make me seem crazy. I needed more than suspicion. I turned back toward the living room, my hands shaking slightly. I sat back down, picked up my cards, forced myself to breathe. Jason raised an eyebrow. "Everything good?" I nodded once. "Yeah, just needed a break." Sarah was staring at her drink, her grip white-knuckled around the glass. She knew, or at least she suspected. I exhaled slowly, feeling something shift inside me. I had let Emily talk down to me, make me feel like I was nothing for years. She had laughed at my expense, belittled me in front of our friends. And now, she was sneaking off right under my nose, convinced I'd never put the pieces together. She thought I was weak. She had no idea what was coming. The silence of the house was different now. It wasn't peaceful or comforting. It was suffocating. Every time Emily smiled at me, every time she touched my arm absent-mindedly while passing by, I wondered how many times she had done the same with Mike. Every late night she spent on her phone, every sudden laugh at a message. Was it him? Had she ever thought about me while sneaking off with him upstairs? I needed proof. I told myself I wouldn't act on emotions alone. That was the difference between someone reckless and someone who wins. I had spent years learning how to operate under pressure, how to gather intel before making a move. This was no different. One evening, while Emily was out, I went through her things. Not like some paranoid husband searching for meaningless signs of betrayal. I was methodical. I started with the obvious places. Her nightstand, her office drawer, nothing but paperwork and old receipts. Then I checked the closet. A small, velvet box sat tucked away behind a pile of scarves, barely noticeable. My pulse slowed as I pulled it out, the weight of it settling in my palm like something toxic. I flipped it open. Inside was a men's watch. Expensive. Sleek. Not mine. I turned it over, and my stomach clenched. To M, every moment with you is worth the risk. E. I stared at the engraving, my hands tightening around the box. Every moment with you is worth the risk. Risk. She knew exactly what she was doing. She chose to do it. A sharp exhale left my lungs as I forced myself to stay calm. This wasn't just a mistake. This wasn't some drunken regret or lapse in judgment. This was deliberate. Thought out. I set the box down carefully, my mind already calculating my next steps. Emily would never admit it, even if I confronted her. She'd twist the truth, gaslight me into questioning myself, turn the blame around until I was the bad guy for doubting her. I wouldn't give her that chance. I needed more. I put everything back exactly as I found it, making sure there was no sign I had been there. Then I moved on to her phone. She always had it locked, but I knew her passcode. It took 2 tries before I got in. I went straight to her messages. The thread with Mike was mostly harmless, at least on the surface. Emily, game night is on. Same time? Mike, always. I'll handle the bets. I scrolled further. Mike, you looked amazing last week. Emily, you always say that. Mike, because it's always true. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to keep reading. Emily, can't wait for Friday. Feels like forever. There it was. My stomach tightened, my grip on the phone firm. I had all the confirmation I needed. Now I needed a plan. Something cold and steady settled over me. The same feeling I used to get before a mission. I wouldn't explode. I wouldn't make a scene. No, Emily and Mike weren't getting off that easy. They wanted to gamble? Fine. I was about to raise the stakes. I spent the next few days moving carefully, making sure Emily never sensed the shift in me. I smiled when she made a joke at my expense. I kissed her goodnight. I even let her believe that I was still the same man who would never suspect her, never question her. She had no idea I was already planning her downfall. The first step was replacing the watch. The engraved one, the love letter she had planned to give Mike, was too good to destroy. It was evidence. Instead, I found a similar model online, identical in design, but completely worthless in comparison. The next time Emily left for work, I swapped them out. She wouldn't realize it until it was too late. But the real weapon wasn't a watch. It was something far more damning. For weeks, Emily had been sneaking upstairs at game night, thinking no one noticed. I had suspected, but now I knew, and that changed everything. I needed undeniable proof, something so irrefutable that when the moment came, there would be no excuses, no backtracking, no lies. That's when I had the idea. A baby monitor. Simple, discreet. A small device that could pick up both audio and video, linked directly to my phone. I picked one up the next morning, paying in cash, and set it up in the guest bedroom at Mike and Sarah's house before anyone arrived for game night. It was easy enough. I had helped them mount their security cameras last year, so no one batted an eye when I excused myself to adjust some wiring. By the time the others arrived, everything was in place. Emily had no idea that tonight was the night her little game would come to an end. We started playing like always. Poker chips clicked against the table, laughter filled the room. Emily leaned in close to Mike, whispering something in his ear. He smirked. I kept my expression neutral, watching as they played their parts like bad actors in a cheap drama. Then, right on schedule, Mike stretched. "Gonna grab another drink," he said. "Need anything, Em?" Emily smirked. "Maybe a refill." She pushed back her chair, glancing at Sarah. "Want any help in the kitchen?" Sarah barely looked up from her cards. "I'm good." Emily hesitated for a fraction of a second before recovering. "All right, be right back." And just like that, they were gone. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to stay seated, to wait. My hands were steady, my heartbeat calm. I had spent years training for high-pressure situations. This was nothing. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. One tap, and the baby monitor feed flickered to life. At first, just silence. Then movement. The soft creak of a bed. A whispered voice. A quiet laugh. I let it play for a few seconds, my jaw tightening. The final proof. Then I cleared my throat. "Hey guys," I said casually. "I've got a little wager to add to the game." Jason raised an eyebrow. "Yeah." I smirked. "How about a live bet?" Without another word, I turned up the volume and let the sound from the guest bedroom fill the room. Laughter, murmured words, the unmistakable rustle of sheets. Sarah was the first to react. Her drink slipped from her fingers, crashing against the table, spilling everywhere. Jason's face went pale, his eyes flicking toward the hallway. The others just stared, frozen in place, unable to process what they were hearing. Then footsteps. Emily and Mike, completely unaware, laughing softly as they walked back toward the living room, until they stepped into the doorway and saw the looks on everyone's faces. Mike's smile dropped first. Emily, slower to react, scanned the room, confused, until her gaze landed on my phone. Then she heard it, her own voice echoing back at her. For the first time in years, she was speechless. Sarah pushed back her chair, so hard it nearly tipped over. "You?" Her voice cracked, her hands trembling. Emily's eyes went wide, her face draining of color. "Sarah." Sarah didn't let her finish. She grabbed the nearest thing she could, her poker glass, and hurled it at Mike. He barely dodged in time, the glass shattering against the wall. "You disgusting piece of garbage," she screamed. The room exploded into chaos. Emily turned to me, her expression desperate. "Jake." I held up a hand, silencing her. Then I reached into my pocket and pulled out my poker chips. Calmly, deliberately, I set them down in front of me. "I'm cashing out." Then I stood up, grabbed my jacket, and walked out the door, leaving Emily to deal with the mess she had made. The night air hit me like a shock to the system as I stepped out onto the porch. I inhaled deeply, letting the crisp wind cool the heat simmering beneath my skin. Behind me, the chaos raged on, Sarah screaming at Mike, demanding answers he couldn't give. The murmurs of the other guests, scrambling to process what had just happened. Emily, standing frozen, trapped in the wreckage of her own making. I kept walking, down the steps, across the driveway, straight to my truck. My hands were steady as I pulled the door open, as I slid into the driver's seat. I didn't slam the door, didn't curse, didn't punch the steering wheel like some betrayed idiot in a movie. I just sat there for a second, gripping the wheel, staring at the house where my life had just officially come apart. And then I smirked. Not because I was happy, not because I wasn't hurting, but because I had won. Emily had spent months sneaking around, lying to my face, treating me like a fool. She thought she was invincible, that she would never get caught, that I would never fight back. But now everyone knew. She had no excuses, no escape, no way to twist the truth into something that worked in her favor. She had lost. And for the first time in a long time, I felt free. A sharp knock on my window yanked me from my thoughts. I turned, expecting to see Jason or maybe Sarah, but instead, it was her. Emily. I rolled the window down slowly, meeting her frantic gaze. Her face was pale, eyes wide with panic, lips parted like she was struggling to find the right words. "Jake," she whispered, "please, we need to talk." I let out a slow breath, tilting my head slightly. "Do we?" She swallowed hard. Just let me explain." I exhaled through my nose, shaking my head. "Explain what, Emily? That you've been screwing Mike for months? That you lied to me? Humiliated me? That every time you left that poker table, you were placing real bets upstairs?" She flinched, wrapping her arms around herself. "It wasn't like that." A bitter laugh escaped my lips. "Really?" Because it sounded exactly like that. Tears welled in her eyes, but I wasn't falling for it. Emily was a master manipulator. She knew exactly how to make herself look like the victim, how to twist the situation into something salvageable. But not this time. I turned the key in the ignition, the engine rumbling to life. "Move, Emily." She reached out, pressing a hand against my door. "Jake, please." I looked at her then, really looked at her. At the desperation in her eyes, the way her hands trembled, the realization sinking in that I wasn't going to forgive her, that I wasn't the man she could string along anymore. I smiled slow and cold. "You should get back inside." She blinked, caught off guard. "What?" I nodded toward the house. "Sarah's still in there, and I'm sure she has plenty to say to you." Panic flickered across her face. She turned slightly, as if debating whether to run back inside or to keep fighting for whatever scraps of control she had left. I didn't give her the chance. I rolled up the window, shifted the truck into reverse, and backed out of the driveway without looking back. Emily had made her choices. Now, she had to live with them. The drive home was quiet, but my mind wasn't. The night's events replayed in my head. Emily's shocked face, Sarah's fury, Mike's pathetic attempt at scrambling for control. It had all unraveled so perfectly, so completely, that I almost couldn't believe how easy it was. Almost. I pulled into the driveway, shutting off the engine and letting the silence settle around me. The house looked different now. Not physically. Everything was exactly where it had been this morning. But I had changed. This wasn't our home anymore. It was a shell of something that had died the second Emily decided I wasn't enough. I stepped inside, locking the door behind me. My movements were automatic, keys on the counter, shoes by the door, straight to the fridge for a beer. I took a long sip, leaning against the counter, letting the cold bitterness settle in my chest. And then, like clockwork, my phone buzzed. I didn't need to check to know who it was. Emily. I let it ring out. A few seconds later, another call, then another. When she realized I wasn't answering, the messages started. "Jake, please, just talk to me. You don't understand. It wasn't like that. You're overreacting. We can fix this." A humorless chuckle slipped from my lips. Overreacting? She really thought she could still control the narrative, twist it into something where I was the problem. I should have expected that. I set the phone down and walked to the living room, collapsing onto the couch. I wasn't angry anymore. The rage had burned out, leaving something else behind. Something colder. Relief. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was constantly on edge, waiting for the next insult, the next manipulation, the next moment where I had to swallow my pride just to keep the peace. The weight of it all was gone. But Emily wasn't done. A sharp knock at the door made my jaw clench. I took another sip of my beer before standing up, moving at my own pace. When I opened the door, there she was, Emily, standing on the porch, her face streaked with tears, her body tense like she had rehearsed exactly what to say. She took a shaky breath. "Jake, can we talk?" I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms. "Talk about what, Emily?" She swallowed hard. "About us. About tonight. About everything." I tilted my head. "Everything? You mean how you spent months sneaking off with Mike while I was too busy trusting you to notice?" Her eyes flickered with something, guilt, shame, or maybe just frustration that she had been caught. "It wasn't like that." I laughed, shaking my head. "You keep saying that. And yet, the baby monitor says otherwise." She inhaled sharply, blinking fast like she was trying to compose herself. I made a mistake, Jake. A horrible mistake. But that doesn't mean we have to throw everything away. I studied her, letting the silence stretch. She really thought she could fix this. That if she cried enough, pleaded enough, I'd fold like I always did. I sighed, rubbing a hand over my jaw. You know what's funny? For years, you've treated me like I was nothing. Every joke at my expense, every time you rolled your eyes, every time you humiliated me in front of our friends. And I took it. I took it because I thought maybe, just maybe, you still loved me underneath it all. I exhaled slowly, meeting her eyes. Turns out I was wrong. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but I didn't care. I do love you, Jake, she whispered. I let out another laugh, cold and sharp. No, Emily, you loved winning. You loved the power you had over me. And when that wasn't enough, you found someone else to feed your ego. She stepped closer, reaching for my hand, but I pulled back. Jake, please. We can get through this. We can go to counseling. I shook my head. No, Emily. We are done. Her breath hitched. You don't mean that. I stepped back inside, gripping the door. Edo. She let out a small, broken sound as I started to close the door. Jake, wait. I hesitated, looking at her one last time. You should go check on Sarah. She lost just as much as you did tonight. Then I shut the door at her face. And for the first time in years, I felt free. The next morning, the world felt different. The air was clearer. The weight I'd been carrying for years was gone. I woke up expecting to feel the usual anger, the tight knot in my chest that had been there since I first suspected Emily was cheating. But instead, there was something else. Relief. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee, watching the steam rise from the mug, listening to the quiet hum of the fridge. For the first time in years, the silence wasn't suffocating. It was peaceful. And then my phone buzzed. I sighed, already knowing who it was before I even looked. Emily had been calling and texting all night, switching between desperate apologies and angry accusations. Jake, please. We need to talk. You don't have to do this. I love you. This is your fault too. You ignored me. You weren't there for me. That last one almost made me laugh. It was classic Emily. If she couldn't guilt me into staying, she'd try to make me the villain instead. But I wasn't playing that game anymore. I scrolled past her messages to one from Claire, my lawyer. Paperwork is ready. Let's move forward. I took a sip of my coffee and replied with a single word. Proceed. Emily wasn't going to manipulate her way out of this. I had spent years bending over backward to make things work, excusing her behavior, convincing myself that if I just tried harder, she would treat me with the respect I deserved. But I wasn't that man anymore. By the time I arrived at Claire's office, I was ready. We sat across from each other in the sleek, glass-walled room as she went over the details. Given the evidence we have, her infidelity, the financial records, the messages, you're in a strong position, she said, flipping through the file. We'll push for an uncontested divorce. If she fights it, she'll only make things worse for herself. I nodded. Good. Claire studied me for a moment. You're handling this well. I exhaled, leaning back in my chair. I think I made peace with it the second I hit play on that baby monitor. She smirked. That was brutal, by the way. I shrugged. She deserved worse. Emily, of course, wasn't going down without a fight. 2 days later, I got an email from her lawyer. She was contesting the divorce, claiming I had emotionally abandoned her, that I had neglected our marriage. I almost laughed. She wasn't denying the affair. She wasn't even trying to spin it. She was just throwing everything at the wall, hoping something would stick. That same night, she showed up at my door again. This time, I didn't even let her inside. Jake, please, she pleaded, standing in the doorway, arms wrapped around herself like she was cold. I made a mistake. Don't throw everything away over one mistake. I leaned against the frame, crossing my arms. One mistake. I raised an eyebrow. Was it one mistake every Friday for the past 6 months? She flinched. I shook my head. I don't care what you have to say, Emily. The papers have already been filed. It's over. Her breath hitched, and for a moment, I saw the panic flicker in her eyes. She had thought I would crack, that I would cave, that I'd be the same man who let her walk all over me for years. But that man didn't exist anymore. You don't understand what this is going to do to me, she whispered. I tilted my head. You didn't care what it did to me. Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't feel anything anymore. No anger, no sadness, not even satisfaction, just exhaustion. "Go home, Emily," I said, stepping back inside. "Or wherever it is you go now." And then, just like before, I closed the door. But this time I locked it. The first night in my new apartment felt strange. Not because I missed Emily, not because I regretted anything, but because for the first time in years, I was alone. And I liked it. No forced conversations. No sarcastic remarks disguised as jokes. No more wondering if the woman I was sharing a bed with actually respected me. It was just me, a six-pack of beer, and an empty apartment that felt more like home than the house I'd shared with Emily ever did. I stretched out on the couch, staring at the ceiling, letting the quiet settle over me. The paperwork was moving forward. Claire had been handling the legal battle like a pro, and despite Emily's attempts to drag it out, there wasn't much she could do. She had no real leverage, no kids to use as bargaining chips, no way to deny what she had done. The evidence spoke for itself. A notification lit up my phone. "Jason, Sarah's moving out. Thought you'd want to know." I stared at the message for a moment before responding. About time. Sarah had held on longer than I expected. I wasn't sure if it was denial or if she had just needed time to process the betrayal. But now she was done, just like me. Jason sent another text. "Mike's a wreck. Guy thought he could fix it." I smirked. Guess he figured out mentorship doesn't pay rent. Jason sent back a laughing emoji, but I knew the situation wasn't funny. It was pathetic. Mike had thrown away a marriage for Emily, and now he was paying for it. Sarah was gone. The house they had built together was being sold, and from what I'd heard, she had already met with a lawyer. Emily wasn't doing much better. Word had spread fast after the game night disaster. Our friend group had fractured, people choosing sides, whispers filling every conversation. Emily had become a running joke, the woman who had bet on the wrong hand and lost everything. She had called me a few more times, left voicemails filled with desperation, then anger, then back to desperation. I never called back. One afternoon, while grabbing coffee, I ran into an old coworker, someone I hadn't seen in years. "Man, I heard about what happened," he said, shaking his head. "That's brutal." I shrugged. "Not really. She made her choice." He let out a low whistle. "Still, you handled it like a pro." "The baby monitor?" "That was cold." I smirked. She deserved worse. And I meant it. I had spent years being patient, being kind, letting things slide for the sake of keeping the peace. But now I had peace without her. The divorce was finalized a month later. Claire handed me the paperwork with a satisfied nod. "It's done. She gets nothing but what she came in with. You keep the house, the assets, everything." I flipped through the pages, feeling a strange sense of finality. "So that's it. That's it." I sat back in my chair, exhaling slowly. I had won. But more importantly, I had escaped. Emily had spent years making me feel small, like I was the one who had to earn her love, like I wasn't enough. But now, she was the one left with nothing. And I was finally free. The divorce was done. The papers were signed, filed, and finalized. There was no more fighting, no more back and forth. Just silence. The kind of silence that didn't feel heavy, didn't feel suffocating. The kind that meant freedom. I hadn't realized how much I needed it until now. For years, I had lived under Emily's shadow, letting her belittle me, letting her convince me I wasn't enough. And for what? A woman who had no loyalty, no remorse. A woman who gambled away her marriage for a few stolen moments in someone else's arms? No, I had wasted enough time on her. Emily, on the other hand, was learning just how much she had lost. Sarah had cut ties completely, moving on like Mike never existed. The divorce had left him in financial ruin, and without his wife's stability, he was struggling to keep up with his bills. I heard through Jason that he had moved into a cheap apartment on the outskirts of town, drinking more than working, realizing too late that he had traded everything for nothing. Emily was no better. She had fought to keep the house, thinking she could use guilt or manipulation to swing the courts in her favor. But Claire had shredded her in negotiations, and in the end, Emily walked away with nothing but what she had brought into the marriage, which wasn't much. Jason kept me updated, even when I didn't ask. "She's been bouncing around friends' places," he said one night, over drinks. Staying with old coworkers, I think. No one's really eager to help her out, though. Guess people don't like being around a woman who burned her entire life to the ground. I smirked, taking a sip of my beer. Shocking. She's been asking about you, he added. I raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Jason leaned back in his chair, studying me. I mean, she's fishing, seeing if you're seeing anyone, if you're still mad, if there's any chance left. I shook my head. She's out of chances. Jason chuckled. Cole, man. She made her bed, I said simply. Now she gets to lie in it. Alone. Jason nodded slowly, then smirked. Mike's probably in the next apartment over, drowning in the same regret. That part made me laugh. The two of them had thrown away their marriages, their friendships, everything. And for what? They weren't together. They weren't happy. They had ruined themselves. And I was thriving. The first time I ran into Emily after the divorce was a few weeks later. It was in the last place I expected, the grocery store. I had just grabbed a six-pack and was heading toward the checkout when I turned the corner and nearly bumped into her. She was standing in front of the freezer aisle, staring blankly at the shelves like she didn't even know what she was looking at. She looked different. Not bad. Not unrecognizable, but less. The polish was gone. No expensive clothes, no perfect hair, no effortless confidence. Just a tired woman who had lost everything. She noticed me before I could walk away. Jake. I sighed, debating whether to just keep moving. But something in me wanted to hear what she had to say. Emily. Her eyes flickered over me, searching for something. I don't know what. Maybe anger, maybe regret. Maybe she was hoping to find the same man who would have done anything to fix things. But that man didn't exist anymore. You look good, she said hesitantly. I nodded. I am. Her lips parted slightly, as if my answer had caught her off guard. She stopped, glancing down, then exhaled. I don't know how we got here. I scoffed. Seriously? She swallowed hard. I didn't mean for things to end like this. I tilted my head, letting the silence stretch before answering. You sure about that? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you made this choice. She flinched. Jake, I was in a bad place. I felt like we were drifting apart, like you weren't really there anymore. I let out a humorless laugh. So, your solution was to crawl into bed with my best friend? Her eyes filled with tears, but I felt nothing. I made a mistake, she whispered. I stared at her for a long moment, then nodded. Yeah, you did. She took a shaky breath. Do you ever think about us? About what we had? For a second, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I remembered the months of humiliation, the lies, the way she had made me feel like I wasn't good enough while she was sneaking around behind my back. I met her gaze and shook my head. No. Her breath hitched, like she had been holding on to the hope that I'd say yes, that there was still something left to salvage. I adjusted the basket in my hand, ready to leave. Take care, Emily. She opened her mouth, but I didn't wait to hear what else she had to say. I walked away without looking back. Emily had lost everything, and I had finally won. Thank you for listening to the end. I hope you enjoyed it very much. Don't forget to give a like, and tell us in the comments what you would do in such a situation.